That is not proper podcast.
You need to be hungry. Exactly. Like, you can't have come in the past like 2 days before you podcast. Otherwise, you're a little bit too lax. You need to be hungry.
Exactly. Otherwise, you're dehydrated. You know, you're a desiccated husk. You need to be wanting it. You need to be have that viv and vigor.
Okay, no. Come on. This isn't Come Town. We need to. We're here to talk very seriously about the European left and Syriza. So, welcome to Alpha Bunga Bunga. This is a special patrons episode. We are here today to talk about Greece and look at the recent elections there, in which Syriza were thrown out of office after 4.5 years in government, and in particular to try to draw out some of the implications of this for the European left. So to get things started, what happened in the recent Greek elections? I'm going to pass over to George to give us a little rundown in terms of turnout, voting, who is forming a government, all the basics.
Yeah, so thanks. So the first election since September 2015. In 2015, there were two elections, one in January of that year, was held on the 7th of July 2019. And basically, the centre-right party, New Democracy, won. They won an absolute majority in Parliament, so they had 158 of the 300 seats in the Greek Parliament. And I think the main thing that we'll probably be discussing today is Syriza. So Syriza got 86 seats. PASOK 2.0, the Movement for Change, got 22. Communist Party 15. Greek Solution got 10, and then Varoufakis's party, Mirror 25, got 9. So in the Greek electoral system, you have to get 3% of the vote to get any seats in the parliament. So I think it's another thing worth flagging just on the outset is the Golden Dawn, the fascists or the neo-fascists didn't make that 3% cutoff, so they lost all of their 18 seats in parliament. And then another thing,
Greek Solution are a far-right party and not a Eurovision entrant, as their name might suggest. So is that what they sound like, Greek Solution?
I
think it sounds like
if they're the solution, then I don't know what the problem is. But yeah, Greek, it's like business solutions. Anyway, we can come back to critiquing their name and or their politics later. But yeah, the abstention rate was very high. So you only had a 58% turnout rate. I mean, this is actually
wow. That's. I mean, do you have the numbers on previous turnouts?
Yeah, I mean, I believe it was 44% in September 2015. I mean, I got all this from Wikipedia, which defines Greece as a 1978 American musical romantic comedy movie. ...
Jesus Christ!
It's all there. It's an important starting point to actually have some facts. I mean, some people believe in the concrete analysis of concrete situations, but you know, each to their own, I guess. But yeah, just Alex did ask me to do this as well. For the first time since 2009, we've got a single party forming the government, and back in those halcyon days, it was PASOK who whatever happened to them, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement. So I think the sort, just to round this up, you could say this election, end of the period of coalitions and the return of political stability. You might not agree with that, but I think it's the takeaway is low voting rates. It wasn't so much a resounding victory for New Democracy as a withering way of support for Syriza.
Yeah, and it obviously is quite demoralizing. I mean, everyone across the left in Europe and beyond obviously paid a lot of close attention to what was happening with Syriza, and in some senses was seen as the great hope, the linchpin of Europe, especially because it was the place in which the euro Eurozone crisis was the most acute, and the kind of Troika's response to it was the most aggressive, that it felt like this was a real linchpin. And instead of the kind of, well, I mean, yeah, I guess it's what you have is a sort of capitulation, and this is the sad ending of it. I think we can be quite explicit about the fact that Syriza being eventually thrown out of government, but ending up in a situation where it is now the main center-left party in a similar way to the way PASOK was, is just the kind of, it's not even just outright destruction, it's just the banality of a return to, quote-unquote, as George said, political stability. And political stability is built on the kind of depoliticization, demoralization, and that's shown in the low turnout rates.
It's world. I mean, I'd say even go as far as to say it's world historic, because Greece was on the front line of the crushing intensity of the Eurozone financial crisis over 2015 to 2016, towards the end of the European crisis. But the most kind of crushing aspect of it was inflicted on Greece. The economy was pulverized, and we'll talk a bit more about the context. But I think this is what made it world historic. At the same time, the almost complete elimination of the hitherto incredibly powerful, domineering social democratic party, PASOK. And it's not your, it wasn't your average social democratic party. I mean, it had helped to modernize Greece. It had taken Greece into the European Union. It also had the prestige and the glamour associated with having been brutally suppressed under the military dictatorship. It took Greece into democracy in the 1980s. So for all of these reasons, the fact that it was so crushed electorally by dint of its capitulation to the European Union, that it was replaced by Syriza on the left, really stoked hopes all around the world. So not just the severity of the financial crisis that put Greece at the forefront, but also the fact that a social democratic party was wiped out by a party to its left, which was a coalition. Syriza was famously a coalition of all sorts of Trotskyists, Maoists, Greens, left social democrats, all sorts of people flocked to the Syriza banner. And so this was the origin of the term pacification, which was to describe the hope of radical leftists all over Europe that the social democratic parties who had become mainstays of these kind of geopolitic political systems all over Europe, that they'd be wiped out, as PASOK had been, pacification. It was particularly picked up by Novara Media and pushed by that crowd. And Syriza has indeed replaced them, as Alex said. And so those two things, at the very least, I think, give a world historic character to the arc of Syriza's political trajectory, despite the fact that Greece is, a relatively small and now impoverished Balkan country, which is more or less a debt colony of the European Union. Something, as Varoufakis, the former finance minister, said, its economy, its bank and finance sector are as controlled as Kosovo, which is, a protectorate of the European Union. So
yeah, I think that a great description of Greece, I think, was done by Stathis Kouvelakis, and this is all in the readings in the show notes if you guys want to check that out, where he describes Greece now as a sort of a economically a Bulgaria or Tunisia with a couple of beaches and ruins, but which is politically like a Kosovo, a protectorate, which is quite evocative, and it comes out also in a context. I mean, if we remember before the Euro crisis, a point that the 80s, the 70s, 80s, 90s, especially, were actually not such a bad period in Greece, because there was an expansion of the welfare state, a certain expansion of the state in general, and some kind of important reforms carried out by PASOK then.
Absolutely.
So
it became a modern country, I think. I mean, that's the thing. It was still a fascist, effectively a fascist or near-fascist military dictatorship in the 70s. And it became, PASOK helped to become a modern country. It helped to modernize and make it, and it also entered into the Eurozone and into Europe. And this was seen to be vindication of their strategy, of their politics.
But it also shows that voters in some ways have quite short memories, or have will step away from a party if it is fatally compromised. So PASOK, it is extremely striking. Out of the 10 million in the Greek electorate, there was 3 million of them were voting for PASOK in 2009, and then it's just zero now. It's like under 500,000 It just shows that the electoral fortunes of a party are not guaranteed just because it played at one point an important role in a country's
very much so.
Political history.
I'd also add to that, though, because Syriza has also inserted itself into the power structures, the informal power structures of Greek society. So my understanding is it's taken over a lot of the clientelistic networks through which PASOK used to rule, but has also managed to capture the support of the oligarchs that also used to support PASOK. And this was the famous case of Tspiras, the Syriza leader and ex-prime minister of Greece, who started holidaying with oligarchs, taking their helicopters, visiting them on their yachts and all the rest of that.
He wasn't involved with Jeffrey Epstein, was he? I just been reading some stuff about that recently, and it does seem, well, Blair was involved allegedly, so was Clinton allegedly. I just wonder if Tsipras had got to that level of kind of international ruling class or not.
The Greeks have their own oligarchs, I think.
Okay, and their own islands of various sorts. Sorry,
okay.
Interrupted with it. Go on.
So let's actually, I guess, move to the crux of this. At least, not the recent elections, but the lead up to the historic referendum in June of 2015, and the fallout from that. So yeah, go for it.
I guess my sort of take on this is that Syriza's been dead for a while. I don't know. One question which I haven't fully got my head around is how Syriza managed to win an election in September 2015 right after going against this referendum result, and despite Tsipras's manifest untrustworthiness. I mean, it seemed like looking back on it now, that was the beginning of the end for Syriza, and they've been dead the whole time. Have only just realized it.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue, those who try to still defend the Syriza project to a certain degree point out that they carried out some reforms here and there which were important over their period in government, despite the capitulation to the EU. And maybe I should cite something here which argues exactly this. I mean, so to take an article from which is in Jacobin, from July 2017. So this is after the referendum, after Greece had decided to swallow the referendum, effectively capitulating to the EU, despite 61% of Greeks having turned out to vote ochi, to vote against accepting the memorandum. This is Sam Gindin and Leo Panitch writing in Jacobin, saying that. That some people are calling it betrayal or capitulation, but you can only call it capitulation if you think that there was a viable alternative centered on immediate Eurozone exit, that is Grexit. And they argue that the political conditions that would have made an immediate Grexit viable are not present today being July 2015. Those who insist that these political conditions were established by the outcome of the referendum are being disingenuous, i.e., Syriza had to accept in some way the memorandum, and all the confrontation between Varoufakis and the Eurogroup during the crisis was basically just negotiation of trying to achieve a better deal, but that basically the option of no deal, the option of leaving the euro was just not a realistic one, and therefore all that came after of Syriza winning another election, but steadily losing support and ending up with them falling out of government now, was somehow a necessary trajectory, and that despite that they managed to carry out some important reforms along the way in terms of education, tax, to make sure that people's homes could only be repossessed by 75% and not 100%, i.e. some limited reform of softening the blow of the deadly austerity that's been applied to Greece.
It's such an outrageous article, so self-defeating and so deluded. Not only, the fact that it's been disproven by the outcome of the election, because they say that the the contempt which the authors in the Jacobin article have for the Greek electorate. They say they'll turn out to vote to spare Greece the far right. Golden Dawn has not even come into the Greek Parliament.
Right. So this is
evoking the specter of fascism in order to terrify people, and it's just completely not even. They've not, not only are they not going to form a government, they've not even got into the Parliament.
So this is in another article, so a recent one published at the beginning of this year by a number of authors, including Leo Panitch as well as Hilary Wainwright.
Sorry, I should have made that clear. Yeah, I was conflating the two.
So I mean, they're consistent at least. So I brought up these two articles just because I think they're exemplary of two very well respected left intellectuals, and in fact more than just those two, who, I think in terms of their theoretical and historical understanding, I have little to dispute with them, and yet their approach to this, is problematic, I guess, because the article which I cited just before was from July 2015, after the memorandum was accepted. This from the beginning of 2019, where they continue to argue that. They say, I'm going to quote again, "There's no denying that the Syriza period has had its fair share of disappointing moments. As with those who recognize the failings of the Workers' Party in Brazil, yet turned back to it in the face of Bolsonaro, many people who are critical of Syriza government will end up voting for it." This is before this recent election where Syriza was thrown out of office. So maybe they failed to foresee that Syriza would be thrown out. But their basic conclusion is that, in Greece, the result of this is much more likely to succeed in preventing the election of the reactionary right. So again, it's kind of, we need to not have any political rupture because that's politically impossible, socially impossible.
Yeah.
We need to have a left government to limit the effects of austerity, and most importantly, to keep the reactionary right out. I mean,
that's the recipe. I think, that's the recipe for defeat.
Yeah, and it's more than that. It has its own kind of excuse pre-baked into it, because it seems like this sort of project, if you are judging success only in terms of keeping out the far right, then basically all you do is you say, the far right is just around the corner. Fascism is lurking everywhere in Britain, in Greece, absolutely everywhere across the continent. And then all you have to do to make your program successful is to inflate this threat, and then to not see it realized. I think there's no way in which you can describe the period in which Syriza were in government as anything other than an abject failure and a complete catastrophe for the Greek economy and for Greek society. I mean,
the Greek people.
The Greek people.
They've pulverized the economy, and they became the arm of the European Union, the local enforcers of diktat decided in Brussels.
Even more, they've been so disciplined and so unwavering in their, as Syriza this is, in their implementation of austerity. So the EU set out, you've got to have 3.5% primary balance surplus. So this is basically, you're spending minus taxes, and so you've got to spend less than your tax receipts. So Syriza exceeded that in 2017. So they put into place a more radical austerity than even the EU required. I mean, there's absolutely no rationale for this. It didn't transform the Greek economy at all, and there's no, how is that stopping the far right? I just don't understand this logic, because it is completely defeatist.
It's important, I think, also to emphasize the far right point again, because Greece's depression was worse than the US depression in the interwar period. It's difficult to understate the devastation that was wrought in Greek society. The exodus of people who fled, the way in which the Greek economy was pulverized through taxes and austerity. And not to mention the sheer demoralization of having hopes kind of raised so high and then brutally brought down by the betrayal of Syriza. So all of that.
It's a continual.
And still fascists didn't manage to take power. Even in a small, less politically stable, less wealthy country that went through a catastrophe on that scale, the fascists were still unable to take power. And I think that is a genuinely significant lesson,
Yeah.
which should be used against all those who can only make their arguments by threatening immediate kind of fascist takeover as a way to motivate their arguments and to motivate their politics.
Yeah, I mean, we should be clear here. Golden Dawn are genuine fascists. You know, not even neo-fascists. I mean, there's no joking around with them. The Greek solution, who have picked up, it seems, some of their votes, but still, I think, did they manage to get into the Greek parliament? I think maybe barely.
Yeah, they did.
They did, but barely.
But
You know, but even that,
I understand also they're like more of a traditional kind of Greek nationalist kind of deeply reactionary Christian Orthodox party.
Yeah.
So I mean, even they're not kind of the neo-pagan weirdo fascists that the Golden Dawn are. They're not the kind of paramilitary marching pagans.
Exactly. Compare the names. One is Golden Dawn. It's rebirth. It's kind of neo-pagan. The other, Greek Solution, business, suit and tie, boring. I mean, it's, no joke. The politics are no joke. But let's
not read off the politics from the names, because that's a risky endeavor. Yeah.
PASOK 2.0, a movement for change, which if you've got change in your title, that you've got absolutely fucking no ideas. Take, for example, Change UK or whatever they now change their name to.
But the point Phil makes is right, that and it surprises me, in fact, and it's a good surprise to discover that the fascists have not been able to grow during this period, and in fact, even if you were to combine the scores of Golden Dawn and Greek Solution, they've stalled. Now, with those who argue the case for Syriza remaining in government at all costs, even if it means implementing austerity, because it means keeping out the far right, that line of argument holds that New Democracy, the main centre-right party, have moved rightwards, and so therefore they have sucked up what would be a fascist constituency. They've become more right-wing, and in fact, one can see, not to jump ahead too much, but one can see a similar sort of argument made in the UK, for example, pointing out that the Tories now, or the Brexit Party or whatever, are the new British Nationalist Party or whatever. I just don't think that's plausible as an argument, just because they're of two different political types. And irrespective of that, the real disaster is the social disaster that's happened in Greece since the crisis hit, since 2010, and which has only continued, and which has no foreseeable horizon, on the future. All that's happened under Syriza, I guess you could argue, is that economic devastation has become normalized. Greece has returned to 1 point something, maybe 2% growth, but the social devastation is still there. And all the young people have left the country. It's a country now of old people struggling on pensions, and the pensions are going to be cut further. And it's a real social disaster. So I don't think you can even make the argument that that softening that blow is a legitimate endeavor when there was the possibility of a radical change. And I think that's the crucial point.
I guess the argument would be things haven't things haven't got any better. In fact, they've got a lot worse. But at least things could be worse. We could have fascism. It could be raining. So
that's the dishonesty of the argument, that that fascism can be used to justify, the threat of fascism can be used to justify what happened in Greece under Syriza, and that is the level of depravity in that argument really shouldn't be understated, because it's been used to justify truly terrible things.
When you say the level of depravity, how would you grade that out of 10, or is it a qualitative scale?
It's more a qualitative scale, but I mean, I don't. They
extraordinarily
justified.
Depraved.
It's extraordinarily blinded and self-defeating, and to justify, to kind of wave your hand over what happened in Greece and to say that there are gains and benefits here, it sounds to me much worse than the kind of straightforward brutality of the European Union technocrat who just says, look, Greece has to make these savings, austerity has to be inflicted, the Eurozone has to survive. That seems to me to be politically preferable, at least because it's honest, compared to the mendacity of saying that, there's been some gains, fascism has been averted, Syriza made some good policies, blah, blah, blah. That just seems to me really repulsive.
Well, some people are saying, unfortunately, this... sorry, Alex.
No, go for it.
No, some people are making this, even today, are making this argument and are carrying it over.
Such as the article that Alex mentioned earlier, Jacobin, New Democracy, published in Jacobin, New Democracy Against Democracy, which was written by Leo Panitch, Eddie Dean, and some others before the most recent election in which Syriza lost office.
I mean, I think it's also a form of analysis. I mean, this is a slight tangent, but a kind of, balance sheet social democracy, balance sheet socialism, I don't know, where, you weigh up the pros and the cons, and you go, and at any point in time you go, right now, this is what bad could have happened. These are the good things that happened. So, on balance, where do you stand? And it's a bit like with the people do it with the Soviet Union. It's like, well, on the one hand, the Soviet Union, included women more. People weren't starving. People had homes and jobs. People, et cetera, et cetera. And on the other side, there was a lot of, a lot of bad stuff in the Soviet Union too. Instead of actually
no blue jeans,
exactly, no blue, yeah. But instead of actually analyzing it historically, and here we're not talking about 50 years of a regime where you're looking at the Soviet Union in the 1970s and going, well, there's some advances there, there's some backward steps, etc. We're talking about a question of 4 or 5 years here where there was a real possibility of a turning point. So just examining Syriza in early 2019 and going, well, there was some good, there was some bad. It's like, no, this is a complete social disaster in which they have managed to hold back some of a couple of the nastiest bits and improve things here and there in the context of an overall decline in income across the board and increasing inequality in that period, and a complete political demoralization. So it needs a historical analysis and not a balance sheet analysis.
I think that's right, and it also means kind of being brutally honest about the scale of the setback, and being willing, like you say, being willing to acknowledge defeat. I think one of the most depressing lessons of this whole kind of era is showing that the left is still unwilling to be honest in its assessments of its own politics, and still willing to, like you say, take this kind of phony balance sheet approach. On the one hand this, on the one hand that, which utterly obscures the reality of the situation, which is that a moment in which there's no denying the fact that a Grexit from the Eurozone would have been genuinely traumatic for the Greek economy in a way that, say, Brexit wouldn't be for the British economy. It's on a qualitatively different scale, but still was the right thing to do compared to the pulverization that has happened to the Greek economy, and also that Greece would enjoy self-determination, a substantive self-determination that would allow it to improve its economic prospects over the long run and more quickly than it's able to within the Eurozone.
So
I mean,
anyway,
it's a very real issue for the European left at the moment. Is the question of how prepared are we to break with the status quo? I mean, do we have phrases? And
the
words?
Political will? Is the political will there to break with the status quo and to bear the costs of breaking with it?
Yeah.
How can you genuinely want political change unless you're willing to countenance political disruption?
Yeah, if you're willing to rupture with the EU, to go against it, and to do the planning necessary, which would have been considerable in the Greek case, and it just going back to 2015, Popular Unity at some point, despite all the weaknesses they had some ideas in this direction.
Popular Unity being the group, the left platform of Syriza, which left Syriza and stood on its own and actually achieved something like 0.3% in these elections. So not a model of success.
No, so they almost got to the 3% mark in 2015, but yeah, they got wiped out in the most recent elections. And I mean that is a kind of an addition to get additionally depressing. That's a kind of side tale, because at one point it did seem like there were some people who had a real will to plan what it would be like to have a a parallel currency for a time, because this is what, of course, would be required or to go back from the euro to the drachma. But it didn't work out like that. They weren't able to persuade people that this was in the interests of the Greek economy and the Greek people.
So before we broaden out to discuss some of the implications, because we're already kind of foreshadowing them, but maybe it's worth referring back to what actually happened in those decisive moments. And it's I would recommend listeners read the interview with Stathis Kouvelakis, the jointly authored article between Stathis Kouvelakis and Costas Lapavitsas, and including the other readings that we've included there, because he's especially Kouvelakis, very clear-sighted and honest in terms of being self-critical, both in terms of himself and also about what left platform could and should have done perhaps in those decisive moments. Because we can't just, I think it would be the wrong approach to be moralistic and say, well, Tspiras is a traitor and blah, 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 and he betrayed us and whatever. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a very clear element of betrayal in terms of pivoting against the 61% who voted to not accept the memorandum. But I don't think that's the most objective approach, just to be kind of moralizing and finger wagging about it. Let's look at who were the actors here and what could have been done differently. What were the key moments and actions that happened, and what with a realistic analysis of what possibilities were.
I don't think it's just an academic discussion either. I think it really, to get into this history and to get into the relationship between the Greek state and the EU is to ask some very serious questions today, or to really think seriously about what would it be like to try to put into place a socially a transformative political project, or an economically transformative project in the context of the EU. And I think the place not to start perhaps is Yanis Varoufakis's memoir, which I think you can read it as one of the most sort of self-deluded and tragic books that you're ever likely to come across, because you have this person who's got all the rhetoric about how you need to go against the EU, and you can do all this stuff, and everything's possible, and I'm a rebel and I'm an outsider, and then he just absolutely hits this brick wall, and the realities of political power hit him, and you think, okay, that must have been an extremely sobering and probably quite depressing experience, but at least from that you're going to learn the realities of this of realpolitik. But of course he goes the other direction, and he doubles down on the reformability of the EU, which I think is quite staggering.
Yeah, I mean, well, no, I mean, I don't disagree with any of that, but it's interesting that even Kouvelakis and Lapavitsas, members of the left platform and harsh critics, they reserve their worst ire for Tspiras rather than for Varoufakis. Varoufakis, at least I think, understood that this was a moment for confrontation rather than collapse. But then there's still that problem that if you're going to be serious about confrontation, you're going to need a plan B. You're going to need an actual exit strategy.
I think it runs deeper though, because so Varoufakis would say, well, I had an exit strategy. He had this, he had this supposed kind of option to introduce a parallel currency electronic parallel currency using people's bank accounts and tax credit paying system. That would apparently, this would be the kind of fallback, so that they had a plan B, which would allow them to exit the Eurozone. So that would be Varoufakis's response. And I've heard kind of criticisms of the kind of credibility of using Greece's tax credit system as the basis for a virtual currency, as a kind of phased withdrawal from the European Union. But I think it went deeper, and it was political more than the kind of technicalities of the system in place, because I think Varoufakis' strategy was essentially still predicated on dissolving away Greek sovereignty into the Eurozone. His notion was that I can try and convince the rich northern countries that it's in their interest not to destroy the Greek economy, and that we can resolve this crisis by moving towards a more unified Europe, a more economically integrated Europe, where the voters of the northern countries see that it's in their interest to support the Eurozone and for some kind of reciprocity to emerge between the southern tier and the rich northern economies. So his strategy was predicated on the idea that there was he'd already surrendered the idea of self-rule, the viability and the desirability of self-rule in Greece. So his whole strategy was predicated on surrendering Greek sovereignty, and that, I think, was his underlying political error, independently of how detailed or credible or significant or how many plans he had in his back pocket as realistic kind of bargaining strategies when he went into the room with the Eurogroup. He was ultimately, there was no desire for Greece to rule itself. And this is why he sticks to his current strategy of remain in reform. He still thinks that the only way for modern liberal democracies in the West and Western Europe to survive is for them to integrate through the EU. So he simply doesn't believe, I think, fundamentally he doesn't believe in the possibility of popular self-rule and sovereignty within the nation state, and that's why he fails.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's worth arguing that the only way that kind of a more positive form of integration and internationalism that could emerge would be precisely through the exit of Greece. And if there were then solidarity movements which would emerge elsewhere, which showed a glimmer of it for a moment around 2015 and then disappeared, that's the only way that you could actually have Europeanism. So in fact, the only way a good Europeanism could come about is precisely through unilateral exits, because that's the only way that there's a shock to the system. I think that such a thing could emerge.
And it's the paradox that genuine internationalism now lies through the nation state, through national politics, through pursuing strategies within particular countries. And that offers the opportunity for rebooting international cooperation in a way that's more democratically legitimate and on a more sustainable and viable basis, which is to say, with the political support of voters in the countries concerned, rather than done above their heads.
I mean, that's
the paradox I think that Marxists have to sell to people in order to show that European supranationalism is unviable.
Yeah, I mean, that is a challenge, because it reverses the entire way of thinking about internationalism that's been dominant in the last 25 years, which has essentially been that internationalism is above nationalism, it's supranational, and you just need to you need to release yourself from the fetters of your nationalist ideology and your national flags and your support for your specific national football team, and then you just kind of internationalism.
Well, or rather, you keep your national football team, but you surrender everything about national politics.
No,
so
I mean,
you get to keep the culture.
Football's problematic and not culture anyway. Some people might say, but yeah.
But this comes back to our discussion with Quinn Slobodian some months back, where he mentioned the point about the kind of neoliberal vision of a constitution, economic constitution, is that you get your kind of you get your cultural autonomy, you get you still get to talk in your own language, and you still get your kind of the accoutrements and the trappings of some kind of cultural autonomy, but the substance of political choice is restricted by the fact that you have economic decision making, which is restricted and curbed and limited and contained within very narrow parameters, because it's all been decided at the supranational level.
Exactly,
so
and I think
you keep your football team. It's important, I think.
This is the serious point that I was going to make, is that we because of this, I think these modes of political thinking either reflect or have been influenced by the fact that we see internationalism too often as a cultural phenomenon. But it's not. I mean, the way that we're talking about it and the way that we mean it is it's a political one, and so it has to be grounded in democracy. And where does that start? It starts in the demos, and it starts in the class struggle, which is always national and which is always grounded in the only context in which workers have ever managed to express any self-rule, which is the nation state. So it is a paradox, and I think it's an important one for us to grapple with, because if you just cede your sovereignty of your nation, as Varoufakis might argue, to a supranational institution, which, by the way, is not democratic and is neoliberal, then that's not a route to internationalism. That's a route to just hollowing out of whatever it is that is supposed to be communicating and cooperating and moving forward together, which is the nation that is the starting point of internationalism. Didn't execute that last bit very well, but you know what? We all agree here, right? Internationalism.
I would frame it slightly differently.
Internationalism begins at home.
It's not so much that nationalism is positive, so much as the fact that the kind of transnationalism frames it's a critique of mass democracy. It's a critique of representative politics, critique of mass politics, dressed up as a critique of national chauvinism. And I think that's the issue. So it's not so much that nationalism is positive, but rather that the politics of anti-nationalism or transnationalism or supranationalism or cosmopolitanism, however you want to frame it, those are critiques of democracy and representative democracy and mass politics, which take the form of a critique of national chauvinism. And this is why the left falls into the trap consistently. It's terror of what is, left genuinely terrified of mass politics. And you see it, the liberal left is in particular, that any form of mass politics is, and this is NOBS, again, neoliberal order breakdown syndrome, any form of mass politics must be fascist, totalitarian. Nationalist politics is terrible, but really it's a critique of democracy per se.
So let me just bring something up.
Let
me just bring something up.
You should write something on this cosmopolitan dystopia.
Really?
You can have that phrase for free if you want.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate that.
So to play slightly devil's advocate, or at least to bring up a point which bears thinking about, both Kouvelakis and Lapavitsas make the point that since
Sorry, I just want to check. Is that the Brazilian pronunciation or the Greek pronunciation or the Italian pronunciation of their names?
I think doing it in a Brazilian way gets me closer to the Greek than anything in English, so I'll go with that.
Okay.
Can you put it with a bit heavier accent, whatever you're doing, because you're halfway there, but I think you could really land it.
Well, I actually wasn't trying anything, but Kouvelakis and Lapavitsas. That's me trying to do Greek.
Yeah,
I don't know if is that. Anyway,
that's exactly what I heard when I went to Greece on holiday last year.
Excellent. Yeah, that's great. Anyway, it is all Greek to me. They point out about the radical left, especially I think some bits of the left platform's inheritor organization, that during Syriza's period they've kind of tried to make some overtures to, I guess, like patriotic nationalist politics, even appearing on some far right channels and stuff like that, which led them nowhere and was demoralizing and lost them a lot of left-wing voters, which is interesting because I think we can obviously imagine certain correlates in Britain, for example, that my position would certainly be that the radical left has to lead the argument for popular sovereignty and can't fold itself into an argument for national sovereignty in itself, and to play that purely nationalist card without the emphasis on democracy, or the emphasis being on democracy as opposed to purely national sovereignty.
But I don't think so. This is the hard thing, though. I don't think that popular sovereignty requires external sovereignty. It requires the form of national independence.
Fine. But we
clarify.
have to. No, I'm fine with that. The point more is just about what is the leading point of that, and not to. And I think it can be seen very clearly with some left wingers who support the Brexit Party, where that is a fold. You lose the argument and you lose the case about the complete democratic restructuring of the polity if you collapse your radical left argument into a nationalist one.
No, I agree with that, and I think that's the way it's a slippery and a difficult argument to make in the context of the political cut and thrust of the public sphere, particularly with all the kind of mania that surrounds Brexit. But the way the European Union works isn't so much that it curbs external sovereignty, national sovereignty, though it does that too, particularly in places like Greece, after it became a kind of debt colony. But with countries like Britain, France, Germany, Italy to a lesser extent. It's not so much that it curbs external sovereignty, so much that it hollows out the internal processes through which popular power is generated, so that it subverts popular sovereignty. And that has ramifications for how the nation integrates and relates to other countries. But the main threat of the European Union isn't to national independence, but to popular sovereignty. And I think that's, I obviously agree. But it's a very difficult argument to draw out, particularly because I think popular sovereignty requires, obviously, external sovereignty and national independence. And it's always a two-dimensional debate at the very least.
Yeah, but one thing it doesn't require, and we can be quite straightforward about this, it doesn't require patriotism. It doesn't require, you don't have to support the England football team. It's not about, it doesn't have any of these kind of
You
cultural...
do, don't you, George? You do, don't you?
Do I? Yeah, of course I do.
Yeah, you do, don't you?
I have my Gareth Southgate.
Not to mention Alex supporting Brazil to the bitter end.
Well, that's easy.
Yeah, but countries are it's not like a mega imperialist country, so it's it's easier.
But no,
that's so completely untrue, man. What about Haiti?
It's sub imperialist. I said it's not mega imperialist, which is a scientific term.
It's striving to be so.
Haiti is Brazil's Iraq.
Order and progress. Patriotism is not required here. I think this is what we need to keep our eyes on. It's about a political process, and the cultural aspects are, while not completely unimportant, as secondary. And it's about where is political accountability? Where can you change things? What are the rules that you make as a political community, and where does the source of that power come from? And if it's leading anywhere than through mass participation in politics, which is what popular sovereignty is, then that's an anti-democratic, that's an anti-socialist institution.
Yeah, absolutely.
E.g. the European Union. And I think Quinn Sabodian's book is very good on some of the contradictions and some of the processes which lead in a variety of different ways to organisations such as the European Union coming to represent some of these kind of anti-patriotic globalist ideas.
Very good. Let's zoom out for just this last part.
Thank you.
Yeah, and discuss, I guess, the implications for the left. I think we can already see and we could have already seen, a couple of years ago, the impact of Syriza's capitulation on Podemos, for example, in Spain. In Portugal the case is a little bit different, where the radical left has, joined up with the Social Democratic Party. But in the cases of Spain and Portugal, you've got cases where the Social Democratic Party has come back with a force, not in any kind of great social sense in terms of there being mass social movements or anything behind the Social Democratic Party, but just that there's enough of a party machine there, which has led it, to survive again. And that's what's happened with PSOE in Spain. It's happened in Portugal too, and in Greece, it's not followed exactly the same script. But what's happened is that Syriza has replaced PASOK, as we discussed at the beginning of this episode, and it's done so in a way in which it's actually much weaker than PASOK was at the time, because it doesn't have the whole party machine that PASOK did. So in Greece you actually kind of have the worst of both worlds. But I guess the two things. One, I guess the question is, what impact has this had on the rest of Europe, especially in the European periphery, where as we already mentioned, everybody was looking to Greece. And secondly, what does this mean for left populism? Has it reached its end? I mean, we discussed this a little bit, I think, in our the Bunga Live we did back in March. Where Caterina Principi in particular was arguing this point from the position of the left bloc, kind of observing the rest of the European periphery. And it does seem to be a little bit of a sad end. I mean, it does seem to be a little bit, can't speak too soon, maybe something emerges, but I think the demoralization emerging from the crushed hopes from both Syriza, where the possibilities were perhaps greatest, as well as with Podemos in Spain, and I guess in some ways Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party seems to have been reaching an end. So those two questions.
Crushed hopes.
I think that's absolutely right. People are still talking about left populism. I mean, I think that's right. So people are still talking about it, magazines, op-eds, articles, academic scholarship, but it's over. I think, that's the point of Syriza shows it illustrates the defeat of left populism across Europe, not only with Syriza, but also, like you mentioned, with Podemos, which is out of the essentially gone, and also with Jeremy Corbyn's with the Labour Party's collapse into Remain and Reform. So that's the real kind of the tragedy of everything that's happened, is that whereas a few years ago PASOKification, the elimination of the old kind of centrist social democratic parties, was what the radical left in Europe was looking forward to. And now, very soon, within a few years, it's already Syrizification, which is to say that the radical insurgencies from the left have been contained, deflected, blunted, curbed, or have just turned inwards and simply kind of taken their seat at the table. And so Syrizification, I think, is the future, basically, of the insurgent left as we see it. The only people that are standing now are the left of the Democratic Party, is the only thing that's left of left populism on the global stage. So Bernie Sanders, obviously, perhaps Elizabeth Warren, and that's it. And so we'll see what happens. We'll see.
Yeah,
what
I mean,
happens
you can maybe Mélenchon. I think France Insoumise, they're still obviously perplexed and haven't been able to incorporate the spirit and energy of the Gilets jaunes there. But I think that's still there's still maybe a question. There's still a question mark over France. But in the other ones, I mean, I think it's obviously sad. I say this with no, with no sense of vindication.
And also, Five Star has been outmaneuvered by the League in Italy. So I mean, everywhere it's Syriza's trajectory describes the brief kind of flash in the sky that was left populism, but it's essentially over. The only thing that remains now is Sanderism, or whatever you want to call it, in the US.
Okay, I mean, I would make an argument.
I think some people get quite down on this. They have their sad boy voice when they're talking about this, and they're kind of they talk about crushed hopes and collected tears. But I mean, actually, to take a step back, in some ways, it's the first real rebirth of some kind of leftist politics after the end of history, and it is quite an inchoate and heterogeneous group of these left populist groups that we've just been discussing, and actually it hasn't really grasped the nettle of how to reincorporate mass politics, and for that reason it, in the European context, hasn't really worked out how to avoid the rock of the EU. And so I think there's more to come. Listeners who are feeling all sad about this.
No. So that's important, I think.
Yeah,
more to come.
But it goes to show the EU is the rock on which they all crash, right? I mean, and I think that's really important. Which is why. Well, let me finish. So I mean, and it's why I think American politics is slightly different, because it doesn't face the kind of external constraints that left politics does, or any politics, in fact, does in the European context. But beyond that, I think, so I mean, where I would disagree with you, George, is only I think that the Panitch route in that piece, New Democracy Against Democracy, the pro-Syriza piece that they wrote in Jacobin, where they try to make a virtue of necessity, and they also try to dress up defeat as victories. If the left does that, then there is nothing to be gained from the experience of left populism. And I think that's, I don't see any evidence that there is any kind of brutal honesty or ruthless ruthless criticism, as Marx put it. There is no evidence of that. And as long as there isn't that, then there'll be nothing gained from the defeats of left populism at all.
I agree. I mean, I would add a couple of other points. I mean, one, just on the question of the EU, I don't think, certainly this is my position, that all left politics in Europe has to be first and foremost against the EU, and that has to be, because that it varies very much by country. There still is a greater degree of support for the EU. I think the argument has to be made against the EU and against supranationalism, but that doesn't mean that politics has to be that a radical left politics has to be entirely directed towards that, because I think the conditions have to emerge for that confrontation to take place. That confrontation was set up in Greece, and Syriza flunked it, and flunked it in such a way as to lead to, in some ways, the worst of both worlds. That you still have the economic devastation that even Grexit would have led to, but you also have the political demoralization that has happened now with Greece, where you have a return to quote unquote political stability and a political duopoly of Syriza and New Democracy, and that's the worst of both worlds. I think it's important to say, because Grexit would have been very severe, and it would have been also a social disaster, but it would have opened up a new possibility, and it wouldn't have led, I don't think, to the degree of political political demoralization, depoliticization that this Syriza experience has led to.
More than, but I think, just to be clear, we shouldn't get stuck on the cleft stick of saying that sovereignty and national independence is something which is valuable independently of whatever the economic costs are. I think the point is Grexit would have been economically costly, but that the medium to long-term economic benefits of withdrawing from the Eurozone, regaining the shock absorber of a floating national currency, right, and having control over your spending, over your taxes, and being able to adapt your economy outside of the completely dysfunctional European Union. Those would have been, it's the overlap of political self-rule and economic flexibility that is necessary for running a modern country.
No, sure. Look, the EU would have could very well also have continued to squeeze Greece in many other ways, even outside of the Eurozone, and eventually outside of the EU. That shouldn't be underestimated. But as you say, it does offer you the kind of sovereign mechanisms to at least create some possibility of a future, which Greece currently does not have. Just my point about having those moments of confrontation versus where those places where that isn't that question hasn't been put, right? So there is no question of Spanish exit at the moment, right? Or in Italy, perhaps that moment might yet come. In the UK, that moment came in a completely accidental way, as we've discussed a number of times on this podcast. And that's what makes the situation in the UK so disappointing, where you've got the actual opportunity, which comes up completely out of the blue, to have a confrontation with the EU and leave it, and also to make much more of a success of that leaving, of that of having an independent economy than the Greeks would have had. Right, for the Greeks, it would have been devastating. In Britain, I think it would have been they could have made a hash of it.
Well, I think so. The differences with Brexit, it's more narrowly a case. Not entirely, but it's more a case of logistic. The economic shocks of logistical reorganization, whereas Greece's integration with the European economy by virtue of sharing the common currency is obviously much more intimate, and therefore the separation would be more costly. And also, it would require kind of ruthless reorganizing of Greek politics, say expropriating the church, selling off the islands, slashing defense spending, which is high in Greece. All of these things would have been, I think, necessary parts of Grexit, and also. But also, not things that would necessarily have been, that would have also had their own political upshots for Greece. But the upshot of I think the other aspect of all of these things is that I wouldn't underestimate how much skepticism there is bottom up for the European Union. So all of what the polls suggest, the most recent ones that I saw suggest is that while people are afraid of the costs of leaving the European Union because they see how difficult and tortuous Brexit is, and these are polls from all over Europe. At the same time, none of them are optimistic. The majority are not optimistic about the future of the European Union. And that's the bind of European politics. People don't see a future in the European Union, and they don't see a way to exit.
Yeah, well put.
And that's the failure, because the left don't offer the way out. And that's the failure of the left.
It's like there is no alternative. But
yeah, well, exactly, right?
Let me see if I can work this out. There is no alternative, but to do anything else is worse. So it doesn't
nice. That's good. No, I like that. That's right. That is the left's position, right? There is no alternative, but actually doing anything is worse. And the left has recreated Tina. So there is no alternative Istina, and the left has recreated it.
Well, I mean, I don't want to put that too strong, and the case differs in different places. And I think part of the problem is that there still is no social movement. I mean, we're talking about political decisions and whatnot, but it's still in very much of a void where there isn't a return to labor militancy, there isn't a mass social movements. There's a couple of exceptions, and one can point to certain glimmers, the movement of the squares and whatever, which led to the formation of Podemos, led to Syriza.
The Gilets jaunes.
And then the Gilets jaunes, which is a different case.
I just think that the movement of the squares sounds like a load of nerds with their pocket protectors kind of going out and demanding political change. And I've never thought of that before.
Well, you've just situated yourself as the leader of precisely that movement. So congratulations on your victory.
Why not?
Yeah, well done.
It's not cool to read a book. Oh, whatever. To do a podcast. I think no.
The Indignados, the movement of the squares, the protests in Syntagma Square in Greece, they were absorbed into left populism.
Right, and then they're disappointed with left. Yeah, no, exactly. So I guess just the point being that we can make these intellectual points, but it also means that the right political moves will not conjure up a people out of the thin air, right? So it's not just if you wave a banner against the EU, suddenly the people will come, and then there'll be this confrontation and so on. Of course not. So we don't want to be glib about that.
No, of course not. And I think a lot of it it must rest on demonstrating the political will for disrupting the status quo, the political will to disrupt the status quo, and a political vision for what you wish to do with greater political autonomy. When you're free of the restrictions that the European Union imposes. I hear lots of root stories, anecdotal evidence about anti-EU banners and slogans and chants and what have you around the Gilets jaunes protest. I wouldn't perhaps underestimate the capacity for anti-EU sentiment to bubble up from below. I guess we'll see.
Yeah, no, that's right. I guess one final point that I wanted to make is just the degree to which we seem to live in an age still of muddling through it and indecisiveness, and that's from nearly all sides.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when the left has an option to do something drastic, as with the Greek Ochi vote and the possibility of Grexit, they turn away from that. In the UK as well, Jeremy Corbyn, a Eurosceptic presiding over Labour Party, whose members are largely in favour of remaining, is unable to make the decisive act, and which would be a brave one, which would be a very difficult one, but the necessary one, and is unable to do that. And this goes for more traditional kind of neoliberal left, centre left governments and parties, as well as for the traditional centre right, as well as even for a lot of the populist right when they actually come into government. For all of their big talk and kind of xenophobic politics and whatever, they end up doing actually very little that's decisive, other than just perhaps just being nastier to refugees and immigrants, and just leading to a general further crudification of politics. But there's no real actor out there who's able to act decisively, partly because many of these parties have weak social bases.
So you're basically saying they're a load of proof rocks. They're just scared to act and just measuring out their political lives with coffee spoons. And what we need is some vital, somebody get shit done. Some kind of
not. Yeah.
No.
That sounds. Where are you going with that?
No,
Mussolini?
we need a bit. No, we need a bit of Leninism. That's actually true.
Yeah, no, I mean, no, but it's right. I think, and the inability to foresee political rupture is what I think weighs on everyone's mind. There's just a kind of almost.
But not the inability to see it, the inability to will it. I think.
Well, nobody even see it.
They see it, but they're terrified of it.
Maybe, but I think I think even Kouvelakis makes this point in the article that there's an epistemological problem of not being able to see a Greece outside the euro, to take the example that we've been talking about, and so you can't envisage that. It's just a complete void. It's a black hole.
It's political vision, though. I mean, I don't know. Epistemological is a very kind of It's a very kind of George way to frame it.
It's a term that's used. It's a term that's used in the article. I wouldn't have chosen that.
No, I know. But I mean, I think it perhaps also speaks to part of the problem.
It's a $5 word,
which is the tendency of the left to frame everything in these absurdly inflated intellectual terms.
No,
it's a matter of political vision, you know.
Yeah,
I understand what it means, but it's a political vision, and it would also require ruthless honesty, you know, because they would have had to sell to the Greek people, you know, blood, sweat, and tears is the only way we're going to get through this, and they're unwilling to. Instead, they promise them kind of fantasies of European renewal on the on the part of Varoufakis, or if we stay in, we'll still stay a European country and we'll still have the cover of European institutions, blah blah blah. You know, the kind of the lies sold by Syriza and Varoufakis.
Yep, I think that's right. I think, and I mean, I guess just to put a final point on this sort of age of indeterminacy and indecisiveness, I think is a product precisely of one of social disorganization. That you can't, it's very hard to rally people and sell a vision of something when very often, you know, the people aren't there. They're not filling the squares. There are some protests here, there are some strikes here, but it's still quite low level, and also a situation that we've forgotten what real rupture looks like, and this is the point that we always make about NOBS, about neoliberal order breakdown syndrome, about that you have an increasingly turbulent situation, but one where there hasn't really been any significant political ruptures. We don't live in a time of the destruction and the creation of new nation states, for example, and things like this. So we just don't have the experience, none of us do, of what that kind of dislocation and formation and reformation of political units actually looks like, and so we can't envisage it, and it's very difficult to make that break then.
Agree.
Yeah, agree.
Okay, speaking of making a break, should we make a break now?
Some political disruption, Alex. Is that what you're promising right now?
We need a Philexit and a
Alexit. Well, look, hang on. Alexit. The name's already there. It's it's much easier. It's a much easier sell.
Sorry.
It's a much easier sell.
That was really. Why could I not think that? A lack of political imagination. I can't imagine how to finish Alex with an IT on the end.
All right, thank you for joining us, listeners and very kind patrons. We will see you next time. We actually have another episode coming out shortly after this one, where we talk to Adam Proctor of Dead Pundit Society, also about the limits of political possibilities today and being realistic. So catch you then. Thanks for tuning in. Catch you later. Bye-bye.
Girlfriend in a coma, I know, it's serious. Girlfriend in a coma, I know, it's really serious. There were times when I could